Today I want to share a short history bit with regard to the topic of the Targums. Now, one might not be familiar with what a Targum is, but those of us who are students of Scripture and theology, in particular, Hebraic, Jewish sources of Scripture, we are familiar with this particular term. The term Targum is a Hebraic term that refers to the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, whether it is translated into the Greek language or Aramaic language. The term Targum refers to a type of translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. In some instances, there are Targums that provide a translation only of Torah, first 5 books. There's also another that is a translation of the prophets. But I want to make mention of these to make you, the congregation, aware of these biblical sources. So oftentimes when we think about the Scriptures or biblical sources, we in the 21st century now, we look at the various translations that are available to us, most of which are primarily from translators in the Western Christian world. And if I say translations such as KJV, King James Version, or New King James Version, or ESV, English Standard Version, or NIV. And of course, there are versions that are popping up every few years that are new. Also among the various, what we will call Messianic versions or translations, there are a variety. And with these particular translations, there is always a source text that the translation came from. And in most instances, the source text that the translations that I just mentioned came from, if we're looking at the Hebrew Scriptures, it would be the Masoretic text, which is a text of the Scriptures that has been produced by the leaders within the framework of rabbinic Judaism.
Yes.
And that particular text was developed somewhere around about the 6th century CE or AD to around about the 9th or 10th century AD or CE. And so that's when the Masoretic text reached its final completed development. And of course, that particular text was built off of other biblical sources that predated. Now, when we start to think about the 1st century, the 2nd century, say the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE or AD, we began to think about biblical sources and consider what were the biblical sources of that time. Well, what we know is that the Masoretic text had not yet been produced, so that was not in use. But there were biblical sources that the people of that time looked to and considered to be of great importance and weight and value. And if you or I were living in that time, we would probably say this particular biblical source is the most accurate. And that particular one is the most accurate. You know how many believers will say the King James Version. Mm-hmm. King James Version. Yep. Yeah. All right. But the King James Version is barely 400 years old. Yep. Right? And it is an English translation of a Hebrew and Greek text. And so when you go back into the ancient time, they thought, just like us, about their particular biblical sources and considered them to be of great value. And I wanted to just share some of the names of these biblical sources in the 1st century BC, 1st century CE. These sources primarily were regarded as Targums. These were translations of the Hebrew scriptures. And there was a major translation, which we use here, called the Septuagint. It was actually the first translation of the Hebrew scriptures into another language. And it occurred in the 3rd century BCE. This particular translation, in the opinion of those of the ancient time, as a translation, had very great weight and very great value, because what it did was put the scriptures into the language of those who spoke Greek. And at that time in the world, the majority of the Judean Israelite community that was spread outside of the land of Israel among the Greek-speaking countries were speaking Greek. And so they had a biblical source that they could read and that they could use in a language that they use every day. So this particular text became of great value and of great wealth. But also there were translations that were produced in the Aramaic language, one of which is called Targum Yohanatan, or Targum Jonathan. This particular one was a translation in the Aramaic language, and it is one that was used by the Judean Israelites in Babylon. This is primarily those who stayed in Babylon, those who did not come back to the land of Israel. Those that were in Babylon, they used this particular Targum. And it's believed that this particular Targum was produced somewhere within the 1st century CE. And it was named after an individual that was regarded highly. His name was Jonathan ben Uzziel. Now, Jonathan ben Uzziel was regarded as a student of the great teacher Hillel. Hillel lived within the framework of the 1st century. Mashiach would have been familiar with Hillel. He was one of the high-ranking teachers of his time. Well, this Jonathan ben Uzziel was one of his students. So the Targum that he produced was one that was of great regard. I probably would liken it unto what we might think of as a translation, somewhat paraphrase, and like an amplified. How many of you ever heard of the Amplified Bible? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. I'm not a fan of the Amplified Bible. I'm aware of it. I'm not a fan of it because I am one who sticks strictly to the text. Mm-hmm. So I don't give much wiggle room when it comes to what the text actually says in the original languages. Sometimes the Amplified, in expressing certain words, it gets a little loose with so many terms that are used where it does not preserve the accurate meaning from a Hebraic mindset. Does that make sense to everybody? So this particular Targum, however, that's just my way of somewhat kind of giving you an idea of it. I'm not saying that it took away any of the Hebraicness or meaning away from the text. That's just my way of explaining that when these translations were done, there was some explanation that was also put into it to sometimes help better describe the Hebraic thought. But this particular one is one that is of value and weight. And there's another Targum that is called the Targum Yerushalayim. Basically, it's the Targum of Jerusalem. And this particular one is a translation of the Torah, the first 5 books. And this translation, you find when you read them, has a great deal of leaning and agreement towards the translation of the Greek translation called the Septuagint. So in looking at these Targums, what we begin to see is that there were biblical sources that they had in the 1st century BC, 1st century CE, that they looked to, that they found to be very credible for them in their time. There's another Targum that came a little later. It's called Targum Onkelos. And this one is associated with an individual who was a convert to Rabbinic Judaism in around about the 2nd century CE. He produced a work that was a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language so that it could replace the Septuagint, the older Septuagint, which was the Greek translation that was existing. And this individual's name, and you all probably know the name because I've used it many a times. Its name is Aquila of Sinope. He is also associated with the Onkelos as well. He produced another Targum or translation of the scriptures in the Aramaic language. And that would be Targum Onkelos. So there are these different Targums, and I'm sharing this because I want us to be mindful of the biblical sources that existed in the 1st century, that the people during that time looked to and found to be very, very credible. Now, the thing about these sources is that they did not always have perfect agreement. There were some where there were portions of verses that were actually removed in some instances in contrast to another Targum. So when I am studying scripture, and most know that we use the Septuagint in our teaching for the Hebrew scripture portion, I have discovered a couple of the Targums that have very strong leanings and agreement with the Septuagint. One is Jonathan ben Uziel of the Prophets, that translation, and also the Targum Yerushalayim. An interesting thing I found out as I was looking at the Targum Yerushalayim is that when I read the portion of scripture that is found in Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, that that particular Targum actually notes that the dwelling of the Israelites, both in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, it describes that the complete amount of time in that particular region, or those regions, was 430 years, which is in agreement with what's noted in the Septuagint. However, in the other Targums, and also in the Masoretic text, when you read Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, it will say that the sojourning of the children of Israel in Egypt is 430 years. Most are completely unaware of these differences. But when you read the older sources, what you discover is that the older sources have information that lets us know that the actual time frame of the children of Israel actually being in Egyptian captivity. Well, no, let's say just being in Egypt, because the total number of years that they were in captivity was not the total number of years where they were in captivity. Well, in Egypt, they were in Egypt for a certain amount of time when Joseph was there, and then captivity came. But the total amount of time being in Egypt was roughly 215 years. One particular individual will say 215, another one will say 210. If you read in the book of Yahshua, it will say 210. So you have these time frames, years of 210 to 220 years, basically roughly letting you know how long the children of Israel were actually in the land of Egypt. And that's based upon looking at all of the scriptures and counting up the times of the different fathers who lived during those periods. But what is not brought to the forefront is dealing with the text of Exodus chapter 12, verse 40, that is noted in the Masoretic text that tells us that the children of Israel were in Egypt 430 years. That is not true. So when we deal with these ancient texts and ancient sources, we find differences. And so I like to share this information about the Targums, these translations, because what it helps us to understand is that in their time frame, they were looking at biblical sources that have, based upon what I've seen and what I've noted here, that had or has a more complete record of information from the older sources in contrast with the newer sources. And so I wanted to share that with us today. Hopefully, it might cause you to want to look into these sources because these sources, these Targums, were also used in the development of the Masoretic text as well, if you didn't know. So we share this with you to try to help educate you, to try to help you as the people of Elohim to look beyond the limited scope, and I hate to say it like this, but I don't have no other way to say it. The limited scope of information that you have been provided. I believe it's very important that we reach back to the ancient sources so that we can get a complete understanding of the truth and pull it all together. So I trust that this has been a help to you. I trust that it has caused you to want to investigate and study a little further into biblical sources. The Most High.